Inline fours pop. V8s roar. And V10s and V12s purr. But one engine can best be described as attacking a wasp nest with a baseball bat. This is the story of the quirky little engine that defied critics and cheated death. This is the Rotary. Way back in the 1890s, what would become Mercedes-Benz invented the car using a combustion piston-based engine. And ever since then, people have been using piston engines in cars for good reasons. However, in the 1920s, a German engineer named Felix Wankle decided that there was another way, and he developed an incredibly complicated, incredibly complex new type of engine using inscribed triangles, impinged ovals, and I'm not going to go into detail on that because that would take way too long to explain. However, he patented the engine in 1929. Unfortunately, there was this thing called the Nazis in World War II that put a bit of a hiatus on his work. So, in 1950s, he actually started development. And finally, in 1957, a working prototype was produced, and it made an incredible 21 horsepower. And by the time it debuted, there was quite a bit of interest with the little engine, as almost every major car manufacturer signed a deal to license that engine. We had Ford, Chevy, Mercedes, Porsche, etc., etc. But the biggest and most important manufacturer to pick up that engine was Mazda in 1961. Now, despite Mazda being the future of the Wankle Rotary, it was actually NSU, the West German auto manufacturer, that made the first production rotary car in 1964, the NSU Spider. This was a little sports car, weighing in at less than 1,500 pounds, and the Wankle Rotary made 54 horsepower at 7,000 RPM. So, it was half good. In fact, it actually competed in motorsport, the SCCH Championship. Unfortunately, since the engine just came into existence a few years ago, the SCCA didn't know how to classify it, so it didn't do very well. However, the next car was even more spectacular. The NSU Row 80 in 1967. This 1-liter, 113 horsepower rotary was a disaster, to put it frankly. The main problem was the apex seals. You see, as the rotor went around in the engine, it wore on the sides of it, and if you didn't have that issue, you would explode the engine. So you had to have seals on the edges so it didn't rub the engine side. And NSUs didn't work. So the engines caught on fire, they were inefficient, and the rotary image, if you will, fell apart. Yeah, not ideal. Especially because that same year, in 1967, Mazda, yeah, we're bringing them back into the picture now, they butted the 0810 engine and put that bad boy into the 1967 Cosmo. This 128 horsepower two-rotor could do the quarter mile in under 16 seconds at a top speed of 120 miles an hour. That's some serious speed in the Cosmo. That's some serious speed in the 60s. Over 120 miles an hour is just as fast as a Shelby GT350R. And just like the NSU Spider that came before it, the Cosmo did have a little bit of a racing heritage. It entered the 1968 Marathon de la Route at the Nürburgring. This 84-hour endurance race. Holy shit. 84 hours is freaking nuts. This basically bone stock Cosmo came 4th overall. And that was pretty much all the motorsport the Cosmo did. But they kept it in production until 1991. And by that time, the Cosmo made 300 horsepower, 280 torque, at 1800 RPM. 1800! That's more torque and more power at that RPM than a Ferrari 458. And it had a top speed of 160. And we're talking 1996. But we do have to rewind it a bit to 1972 when the next major rotary car came into forte, the RX-3. This was a slightly more base model Cosmo. The Cosmo was the Halo car, the RX-3 was its little brother, and as a result it made a less 110 horsepower and 100 torque, but it weighed just 1,900 pounds, which meant it was fun to drive, it was cheap, and it was pretty decent around the corners. And since these rotary vehicles were actually being successful for Mazda, the next most logical decision then is to put the rotary engine in a pickup truck. What? Yeah, 1974. They made a limited run, because no one bought it, but it was a limited run, rotary pickup truck. Yeah. They also experimented with a front-wheel drive rotary engine. This is using the 13A engine, shortly after the pickup truck. And this was the only front-wheel drive car ever to be fitted with a rotary, making 126 horsepower. And again, people didn't really buy it, so they stopped making it. However, there is one car that everyone knows the rotary for, and the one that everybody bought. The RX-7. And we gotta split this thing up into generations, because it's that big of a thing. First off, the first gen, it was introduced in 1978 with the 12A engine making 100 horsepower. Yay. But by 1983, they got a big old bump in power and bumped that top speed to 130 miles an hour. It also got four-wheel disc brakes at all four corners and a limited slip differential with 50-50 weight distribution. It was a proper sports car. And it was actually on Car and Driver's 10 best list in 1983. It's a pretty darn good car. It's not very quick in a straight line, but it is a hell of a lot of fun through the corners. And the final edition, just before the Gen 2 came out, made 163 horsepower with the help of a turbocharger thrown onto that little two-rotor. Now, this vehicle, unlike the Cosmo and the NSU and the RX-2 that came before it, this thing has a rather big motorsport pedigree. It won the British Touring Car Championship twice in the 80s. It won the Spa 24 Hours, the Australian Touring Car Championship, the IMSA GTU class 7 times in a row. 7 times! You can't even count that on one hand. But the maddest one was yet to come. In 1984, Mazda Europe entered a 300 horsepower rear-wheel drive wide-body kit Mazda RX-7 RX-7, yep, RX-7, into the monstrous Group B rally. RX-7 was equally mad. They had to make 200 road cars, which were also equally mad. And it wasn't that successful, if we're being honest. You see, the Audi Quattro came along in the Peugeot 205 and the Delta S4, and kind of humiliated and ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And rear-wheel drive with 300 horsepower was never gonna compete, so they stopped after a few years. Yeah. But the second generation came out in 1986, just as Group B died. And this thing was aimed squarely at the 944 from Porsche, and this 13B engine was upgraded to 200 horsepower and featured a twin-scroll turbocharger on it to give it a better giddy-up in the low RPMs that rotaries have notoriously struggled with. And on top of that, it got some rack and pinion suspension and steering and disc brakes as standard, so it could actually turn even better than the original. And then they started to get nitty-gritty with the special editions. They made just 250 of the limited sport model, which weighed a scant 2,600 pounds, which is not bad for the 90s. And just like before, it was pretty darn good at motorsport. You see, GTU, which is what the original first gen competed in, was a bit too boring for Mazda, so they bumped it up to the GTO class. This was the GTU class on many steroids. The 4-rotor GTO RX-7 made 640 horsepower at 8,500 RPM. And this is in a car weighing just 2,100 pounds. It was so good that it won the 1991 championship, the last championship win for Mazda. And with that, we move it on to the third generation. This newly upgraded 13B rotary was fitted with not twin-scroll turbos, but twin turbos, fully twin turbocharged, making 252 horsepower, with 10 psi of boost flowing through that engine. And even with modern-day safety features required and all the fancy electronic gadgets, it weighed just 2,900 pounds. And if you wanted special editions, oh boy, were there a few for you. The Aussies actually got one of the better versions called the SP. This was required for the Australian Touring Car Championship, and they had to make 25 of them, so they made 35 because they liked people. And this bumped the horsepower up to 273. It also gave it adjustable suspension, carbon fiber components, and aggressive aerodynamics. However, the crown jewel of the final generation of RX-7, the Spirit R. This bright yellow monster made 276 horsepower, 231 torque, and that little rotary propelled it to 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds and a top speed of 160. It is a genuine sports car now, not just a playmate that couldn't accelerate. It was a serious track weapon. And then they discontinued it. But they did kind of bring it back in 2002 with the launch of a brand new rotary sports car. Well, I say sports car, it's a 4-door-ish. Like 2.5-door? I don't know, do the back, I don't know. Point is, this RX-8 used a slightly detuned 13B because it is more family friendly after all. And it made a respectable 232 horsepower. However, it wasn't as well received as the RX-7 It didn't compete in very much motorsport, it wasn't very tunable, and it didn't have the crazy aftermarket that everyone loved about the original RX-7. That being said, they did do some experimentation with the rotary design in it. They made a hydrogen-powered rotary, the only one in existence actually, which made 107 horsepower. And then the concept never went any further because hydrogen power was a bit far away in 2003, we'll be honest. Kind of jumped the gun on that one a little bit. But, what you really wanted was another Spirit R, introduced in 2009. This tuned that power up to 250 horsepower, which did 0 to 60 in a respectable 5.7 seconds. And despite the RX-7's impressive top speed, the RX-8 could best that with a top speed of 170. 170 miles an hour is the fastest road wheel Mazda ever built for mass production. That's pretty darn impressive. Well, it's not impressive. European regulations. Yep, the emission regulations were amped up in 2010 and the RX-8 was killed off that year. Which means the only rotary vehicle left was Formula Mazda using a single-rotor open-seater introductory racing course. And that too switched to piston-powered vehicles in 2017. And then the rotary was done. There have not been any new rotaries since then. Oh, you're still shouting at me, saying I haven't talked about these other rotaries? Well, don't worry, I'm going to be covering that too. Because we all know what the most famous rotary of all time is. It's not the RX-7, it's not the RX-8, it's not even the Cosmo. It's the 787B, baby. Similar to the 4-rotor in the group GTO class car, this 4-rotor 2-liter engine, 2 liters, okay, bear in mind 2 liters, which makes about 200 horsepower these days, made 900 horsepower with the rotary engine. 900 horsepower from 2 liters. And it was clearly worthwhile because the 787B with that 900 horsepower 4-rotor won the 1991 24 Hours of Le Mans, becoming the first Japanese car to ever win Le Mans outright. And if you exclude Toyota not really having any competition because everyone else pulled out and all these complicated things that I want to get into right now, they're the only Japanese manufacturer to win with a challenge under their heads. Oh, and it was also banned that year. Yeah, sorry. Apparently, the engine was so good that after they disassembled it for analysis and make sure they weren't cheating, the FIA found that the engine could run for another 48 hours straight, they estimated. So, the pistonless cars were banned from that point on in endurance racing. Good job, guys. And Mercedes also did some tinkering with the rotary engine with the C11 concept car, which made 350 horsepower and did 186 miles an hour. That's quick. And AMC, you know that crummy little pacer thing that looks like a fishbowl? They actually designed that entire car around the rotary engine. They were so convinced by it. And then they didn't end up using the engine, but the car was designed for it. So that's something. Even the USSR communist guys put some 2 rotors in Ladas for the secret security services, aka the death squads of Stalin, or whatever. Yeah. Even the Russians had rotaries. Who would have thought that? So, what is the future for the rotary engine? Well, in 2013, a rotary was used in a EV system for the Mazda 2 RE concept, and Mazda has continually told us there might be an RX-9 coming out, with a hybrid electric system thrown in for good measure. And that is leading to an awful lot of speculation that, they might bring back the Rotary. And although Mazda hasn't confirmed or denied anything, it is interesting to speculate. The Rotary was a science experiment that shouldn't have really have worked. It was far more complex than the piston engine, it was far more fuel inefficient, and it was far less prestigious and commonly accepted. And yet, despite these obstacles, despite these struggles, the Rotary persevered and powered some of the greatest cars ever devised from Japan, or Germany, or communist Russia. And people will still hate on it to this day for saying it was an inefficient waste of time and money. But if you don't try something, will you ever know if it works or not?